Hi Awesome Blossoms, welcome back to my channel. I'm Anna. Thank you guys so much for tuning back in and just kind of sticking with this channel through its ups and mostly downs. I hope you all have had a great summer so far. I know a lot of us in the US are struggling with extreme weather and just all of the other things that go on in this country. But if you're here and you made it through the first half of 2021, I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful to be here sharing poetry and still being able to talk about all of the cool things that poetry has to offer. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Before we get started, I do want to put a disclaimer out there. This video will be talking about mental health illnesses, including depression, postpartum depression, and sort of all of the other things that kind of come along with that. I just want, for anyone who may feel uncomfortable with those topics at the moment, maybe skip through this one or watch one of my previous videos that talks about other topics. I will do my best to keep it as clinical as possible, and we're not going to get into too great detail. We're definitely going to have to touch on some of those topics because of the nature of the book, so I just want to let you guys know in advance. Okay, so the book that we're talking about today is called Just to the Right of the Stove by Elizabeth Horan, and this is written in honor, well, not really in honor, but for Sylvia Plath, with whom the poet shares some similarities. For many of you who already know who Sylvia Plath is, she is a prolific writer. During her lifetime, she lived up until the 1960s. I'm not quite sure when she was born. I'll have that at the bottom of the screen. But yeah, she lived as a writer, a poet. She was a mother, a wife, and I think most importantly for Sylvia, she would most want to be known as a woman first and foremost, because I think a lot of the things that she writes about struggles with the identity of being a woman amidst all these other identities that sort of take up space. All of these different identities that pulled on her, it really wore her down, and it was hard for her to figure out her place in the world. And then on top of that, she suffered from depression, eventually in 1963 committed suicide. Because of the title of this book, which alludes to that, I think she stuck her head in the oven and basically suffocated. She was mourned by a great majority of women across the world, across the US, but also the literary world lost someone who was far ahead of her time in her writing, in her insight. And so for Elizabeth, she felt a kinship with Sylvia in that they both suffered from depression. But this is also sort of a rising collection in that Elizabeth laments the fact that a lot of the resources that she had access to in the 21st century were not available to Sylvia, and therefore Sylvia suffered greatly and eventually succumbed to her depression because the resources were just not there. Sylvia represents a lot of women of her time who did not have the support that was needed to get better. And so Elizabeth gets into that in her collection, but also her content is more geared towards depression and sort of the inner workings of the mind when you're struggling with that, but also coming alongside that, the identities of motherhood and womanhood and how those can weave their way into creating this narrative that your mind makes up for you about who you are. So that is sort of the premise of this book, but I do think of this book more as a well in which there's always water. It's in my opinion, if it's not bottomless, it's so deep that I haven't managed to find the bottom. The amount of references and literary connections that Elizabeth makes in her poetry, it's so rich and connected to all of these other bodies of work, not just by Sylvia Plath. She also brings up other writers that we'll get into who were just pioneers of female literature. We're going to get right into it. There are two parts in this book. I'm not focusing so much on individual poems. I'm more focusing on themes and just things that I noticed. So one of the really big themes that we discuss in this book, it has to do with motherhood. So Elizabeth suffered from postpartum depression, and going through that while being a mother is incredibly difficult. The way that she writes, it really does feel as if she is battling within herself as to who she is in relation to these children that she has brought into the world, and how that affects who she thought she was, who she thought a mother was supposed to be. There is this standard in her mind of what a mother is, and especially in part one, she is not living up to it. She is feeling very inadequate, like she is depriving these children of a mother because she cannot seem to get her mind to settle on an identity of who she is. Part one, I think, is really a lot about despairing and trying to wrestle with who a woman is. One thing that I really did appreciate about Elizabeth's work is that she is not in any way, shape, or form dressing up her struggle. She is not trying to make them presentable for us. She is giving us the raw and unadulterated thought process of what is happening to her, and it is graphic and incredibly honest, and it is not pretty or glamorous. It can be vulgar at times. It is saddening for her as she's experiencing this. It always feels like the struggle is just on the cusp of loss rather than victory. This book is really visceral. It's not really for the faint of heart. There are a lot of shocking things that she says about herself, about women, that you may not be used to hearing, especially as she describes her experiences. I don't like to think of her poetry as metaphoric, as in like, oh, it just represents something nicer, but I'm making it sound worse. I don't think, or a sound more shocking. I don't think that's what she's doing. I think she's giving you an accurate depiction of what is going on in her mind. However, the imagery is quite vivid. It's very literal still, and often it feels, at least to me, it felt like a battering ram of like, she is really breaking down what I guess popular culture would say about women. She is not hiding her weakness at all. She is not sugarcoating her struggles. She is giving you the full force of what depression is doing to her. I said in my notes, she is vicious in her descriptions, and as a result, it does evoke a lot of visceral reactions in you. You're gonna have to reflect and pause as you read this. You're gonna need to take a breather, maybe check your rage, soothe yourself, and she's just gonna tap into the full range of emotions in this collection. And that's what this book does. It really just sits with you. It makes you face a different reality. She presents this experience as demanding, but as you read her work, and not necessarily in individual poems, but I found this more to be reminiscent of sort of the entire work as itself, it is not just a demand to be taken seriously or to be acknowledged as real, but it is a demand to be loved, not only by herself, but by other people, even people close to her who may not understand what is going on with her, but this is a demand to be loved as she is in this state of fragment. I wrote in my notes, she is demanding to be loved for herself and also for the women who died at their own hands because society was too busy trying to fit them into a box. And I really do feel like that is the crux of the entire book itself. You might not see it in the individual poems. They can be quite self-depreciating or quite distraught, quite fragmented. They can be uplifting and hopeful or despairing, but I think in its entirety, she is making a statement that this is who I was, who I have grown to be, and through the end, as she makes this sort of journey into a more healthy state, she's saying, I've had to learn how to love myself in all of these stages. Another interesting theme in Elizabeth's collection, this depiction of a womanhood and identity. There are several varying depictions of womanhood, also within the context of motherhood, context of being a wife, context of other women and how they present themselves. There's always a comparison. She really wrestles with that. There are a couple poems where she speaks about other mothers or herself and how she wishes she could be different, or different things like that. Really what I noticed that I'm sure a lot of people will relate to is the fact that mental illnesses are able to convince you of a completely different identity than what you actually are. It lies to you. It tells you that you're not enough. It tells you that you can't be loved as you are in this state. It tells you that you're a bad person. It tells you that you can't be a good mother if this is what you're thinking. All of these intrusive thoughts sort of pick away at who you are and convince you that this despairing state is now who you are and you can't be loved like that. She's not only wrestling with her depression, she's also at the same time trying to make sense of Sylvia's depression in relation to her own. And there is definitely this almost this dialogue even within the poems where her voice becomes Sylvia's voice talking to her or talking to herself, and they are really both of them wrestling. For Elizabeth, at least, she is fighting her way back to her children. She's definitely, the wrestling is for a purpose, to find a way to be there for them. This, of course, requires a lot of self-acceptance, a lot of support from other people. The dialogue between herself and Sylvia it pops up in different poems. It's not announced. You just sort of have to realize that, oh, she's not talking about herself, or oh, this is not Elizabeth's voice, this is Plath's voice coming into the poem. Sometimes they'll take the form of intrusive thoughts, sometimes they take the form of uplifting thoughts, encouraging thoughts. Sometimes she is speaking to Sylvia, lamenting about a certain aspect of life. For the intrusive thoughts, I find it interesting, sometimes she puts them in Sylvia's voice and then promptly uses her own voice to quell them, to put Sylvia almost in her place of like, I'm not listening to the intrusive thoughts that you're giving me right now. This is not real. I can't comprehend the negativity at the moment. Give me rest, give me respite from this. But there are other moments where Sylvia is speaking, or she's reminded of something that Plath once said, and she's listening. She is taking it to heart, and it's always this constant battle or roundabout that they go in through, especially through the first section of maybe positive emotion versus negative emotion. I think the reason why it works so well is because in a way they are both sympathetic to one another and they recognize their shared pain and shared experiences. So we're going to get into some format parts of the book before we get into references. So one thing that was I think one of the most artistic ways that I've seen maybe mental illnesses depicted in poetry, it's not just talking about it, it also has to do with the formatting of the poem itself. And as you read, it's an unavoidable reality of this book that as mental illness can fragment your identity, fragment your thought process, she fragments her poems, quite literally breaks words in half. It's almost like you have to just read it really fast and keep going because the lines are broken in between words, and you, at first when you read it, you're like, what is going on here? Is this a typo? But it's on purpose because this is how her mind is processing information. It is not a line, it is not a spiral, it's not scribbles, it's not untidy, it is shattered. And that is how the poem reads. And it's a different experience of reading poetry because your mind is having to process this information as she has processed her thoughts. It is almost as if in writing the poetry, even as fragmented as it is, it's like it's piecing it back together, but not the way that it was before, but in a different way. It's like reading the thoughts of the poet as she remembers it, not as necessarily a polished version of it. I found that to be, for lack of a better word, refreshing, because when you read a lot of poetry, you hear a lot about depression, you hear a lot about anxiety, you hear a lot about OCD or bipolar disorder, all of these various ones, you hear a lot about them in poetry because this is where people put their pain, put their frustration. This is where people get to be seen as they are and accepted. That's what poetry does. But I don't think I've seen another collection as of yet that presents the poem almost as I would think it appears in the poet's mind. I thought that was a brilliant way to get across this idea of a fragmented identity. Some of her poems read, in my opinion, like inner monologues or inner dialogues, especially the ones where Plath is also there. There's a lot of switching, if that makes sense. So she'll start off with a certain theme, maybe it's more self-depreciative, and she'll have to, like, in the middle of even a thought sometimes, refocus and turn it around and say, and find maybe a shred of hope, or sort of self-correct herself and be like, no, that's not right, that's not real, and refocus, because she's almost like derailing her own thought process in order to correct it, which I think speaks to the struggle of what intrusive thoughts actually do and the sort of vigilance that we have to have against them, because they just pop up, and sometimes you're not even aware that you're running with a train of thought that's destructive, and you have to, in the middle of it, be like, wait, no, let me turn this way and get back to the way that I need to be thinking. For one of the poems, it's called The One Who Flew Over the Who or What, she quips, hand on one hip. That's alluding to the film One Who Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, I think, which does have to do a lot with, it has to do with a mental institution, if I'm not mistaken. I've never watched it, but I know, I think it was the new Netflix series Nurse Ratched, that was sort of also about that story, but it has to do with mental illnesses and asylums back in the day. And so she, in that poem, all of her poems are interesting, but it was an interesting poem that really stood out to me because she is now using comparison between herself and what she considers to be maybe a vapid housewife, or maybe a perfect housewife. And I used or made up the phrase maladaptive pep talk, because that was sort of how I saw what she was doing. I don't know, maladaptive daydreaming is an actual thing. I don't think maladaptive pep talk is not a thing, but I think of it as this. So maladaptive daydreaming is sort of when you're daydreaming, but maybe as a way of escape, or I don't remember the exact definition. I'll have to put that over here. But I saw it as she is comparing herself to perfect housewives that don't have any problems, and saying that she is better than them even with her problems. And she's giving herself this pep talk of like, I am better than them. I can do everything that they do and more, even as I am depressed. No matter how scrambled my mind is or how fragmented it is, I'll never be like them. I'll never be either like ignorant of problems, or it's an interesting twist. So I think she states that she's smarter than they are. She can run mental circles around them. But the real interesting part of that poem was she calls herself chosen, because whoever gave her this brain that has all of these, mental health issues, they gave it to her because she can handle it. She's the strong one. She's the one who can handle it. They couldn't handle it because they don't have problems. They don't know what it's like to struggle, but I can handle it because I'm the strong one. And it seems contradictory. Which is why I say that it's maladaptive pep talk. It's like hyping yourself up for something that maybe you shouldn't hype yourself up about. I thought that was probably one of the most interesting poems in the collection. In the middle of part 1 and part 2, pretty much right in the middle of the collection, like right down the middle, we have the interlude, which it quite literally like broke my brain for a little while, because it's not necessarily a readable poem. It's more of like a code that has to be cracked. Yeah, this mind-bending code that she's created includes both her name, Elizabeth Horan, and Sylvia Plath's name, but she doesn't write the names as Elizabeth Horan and Sylvia Plath. She breaks them up so much into pieces that at times they are not decipherable as to who they belong to. And you could say, oh, well, this is kind of, you know, part of her pattern of these fragmented poems. And I think this one in particular is actually a little bit different than that. So I feel like the first half of the collection wrestles with the similarities that Elizabeth feels with Sylvia, and how they in some ways align in their different mental health illnesses. However, the interlude is where the separation begins to happen. So it's like she is peeling herself away from Sylvia's struggles. This is where like the divergence happens. Sylvia's path ended tragically, but this is where Elizabeth starts to have her healing and her recovery. So honestly, I didn't crack the code. It's an incredibly hard poem to read, I think for good reason. And there are words and the phrasing I just couldn't crack. I couldn't figure out sometimes where one word began and one word ended, or what the word was, because even though they're fragmented, they're also intertwined. So like Elizabeth's name will start, Sylvia's name will start, and it's kind of just interwoven. But the visual is jarring and striking, because you feel like, oh my God, something's happening. I don't know what it is, but something is happening. And I think that's, in my mind, that's where I go back to the well of like, oh my God, it's deeper. It's getting deeper. It's not actually like, I'm not actually like gonna find a bottom. Like it's just getting deeper. And to me, I love that about this collection. So in part 2, we are moving into healing, which for a lot of poetry collections that I've read, it does denote a struggle, but it is also incredibly hopeful as we move into that segment of the poet's life. However, for Elizabeth, as we know, she does not sugarcoat anything, and for her, healing is not this sort of rise. It's not like you hit rock bottom and then you rise, and it's like this continual line. It is a very convoluted process in which there is no straight line, there is no glamorous path, it's not always filled with hope, it's a trudge into healing. And so many times she's despairing, many times she has to refocus, reshift, take the derailing train of thought and put it back on the tracks continuously. And there are many times where she doesn't see what the point is, she doesn't understand why this is happening, why she's doing all of this, but you slowly begin to see the progression of how her thoughts are changing, her thought processes are changing. The self-depreciation that you may have seen, the despair that you may have seen in part 1 is slowly lifting out of the shadows. I think that's indicative of a really important concept that I think is true for healing, in that when you're healing, remember, your reality and your identity you've been convinced that it's something other than what it actually is. And in order to almost recondition your mind into accepting what the reality is, who you are, you have to believe what you're saying and not what you're feeling. It's such an important concept of like, oh, but I feel this way. But the reality is that whatever you're feeling about yourself, it's not true. That's what depression is telling you. That's what the anxiety is telling you. The reality is you are capable, and with support, with love, with time, you are capable of reaching the goals that you want to set for yourself. You're capable of being the person that you want to be for other people, of being the person that you want to be for yourself. Those are the real truths. However, because of the conditioning that your mind has gone through, the fragmentation and the questioning and the doubt of who you are, you have to believe those core truths instead of how you feel. I wrote that it is the confusion of learning that your feelings are not final, which is one of my favorite Rilke quotes. I'm never going to stop talking about him, but he had written in one of his, either his letters or poems, that no feeling is final. And I think that is something that Elizabeth is beginning to understand in part 2, is that the feelings that I had in part 1, they're not final, and I can have better feelings now as I start to heal. But it's a daily wrestling match of going through that. But as she is learning to separate herself from Plath, she begins to have those lines where you know, oh, she's definitely getting better. Oh, she's going to make it through this. I almost think at times there might be a little bit of survivor's guilt in that if only Sylvia could have gotten the help that I got, she would have made it. If only at the time so many other women could have had the support that I had, could have found the medical care that they needed, could have just been listened to and taken seriously instead of passed over and dubbed as hysterical or thrown into an asylum because somebody didn't like how they were handling what was going on in their mind. You know, if only those things had existed back then, so many women would have made it. But knowing that her striving for survival is almost like her way of living for those women, living to honor them, in a sense of like, they didn't get the help because of the way society is, but I have the opportunity to do so I will, for me and for them. Okay, so the last thing we're gonna get into is one that I feel somewhat inadequate to talk about, but I do recognize a lot of the references, definitely not all. And so we're going to talk about other writers that were mentioned in this collection. So one thing that you will definitely notice right off the bat about Elizabeth is that she is incredibly smart. She has an MFA in poetry from Lindenwood University, and it shows. There are so many references to literature, to culture, to women who were, you know, just pioneers in writing, in art, that she alludes to in her work. And sometimes she names them. Sometimes I think the references are maybe more subtle, that I haven't read those works and so I didn't pick up on them. I just have this inkling that there's just so much more that I didn't catch because I'm not as well read as she is. But that actually inspires me to read more of these writers so that I can then come back and read this book and be like, oh, found a new reference. So a couple of the people that she makes mention of in this collection are also prominent writers of Plath's era. So we have Virginia Woolf, who I'm sure many of you also know. I kind of think of Plath and Woolf as like two peas in a pod. They write about similar things. Many of the things that they write about are basically echoes of each other. They write so well, and I think so many women of their time were just enraptured by their words because they felt those things. They had those thoughts, but nobody was saying them. And Plath and Woolf were, and it was just like finally being seen for the first time for a lot of women. I think also Virginia Woolf also suffered from depression and also committed suicide like Plath. And so there is definitely a similarity in terms of depression between Virginia, Sylvia, and Elizabeth. Then we also have mention of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who many of you may not know her by name, but she is the author of the famous Yellow Wallpaper, which is about postpartum depression and how a woman is basically put in isolation by her husband after being hysterical or just down. And so she is kind of put into isolation by her husband, is not really allowed to do anything, not really allowed to see anyone, sort of by order of the doctor as well. And she goes crazy. Like, she begins to see herself in this yellow wallpaper and she's trapped there, and she kind of goes crazy, and it's a very haunting story. One of the most famous pieces of literature out there in terms of female literature and also mental health literature. There's like a couple of poems that really do just reference the yellow wallpaper right throughout, and it was quite fantastic, at least for me, to see that referenced, because I've never forgotten that story after I read it. If you haven't read it, I would definitely advise you to. It will definitely, at least for no other reason than to improve your understanding of this collection, but it will be in and of itself a good experience for everyone. She makes that reference, and it's really cool for me to see that in another piece of work, because it's like, oh, I feel like this work then is like now supported by all of these writers who've gone before Elizabeth, who have had their struggles, and she feels almost supported by them, even in their despair. Then I believe, I'm not entirely 100% sure, but she references a Louise G, and I believe that is a reference to Louise Gluck or Gluck. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Yeah, she references that poet, I think, and so that's another really great female writer. She's written a number of collections, one of which I have on my shelf somewhere. Right there. And then a couple of themes that I noticed that she referenced, or at least one main theme that I feel like she sort of never specifically references, but I think alludes to sort of distantly, or that could just be me projecting, is this idea of the monstrous woman, which may not be a concept that a lot of people are aware of. I know that I read something about this, and if I do find the article, I will link it in the description, because there's a lot of actual concrete research done about this. I just think I read like one article and I was like, that makes sense, and I didn't have time to like continually research it. But the idea of the monstrous woman, I think, started back with Beowulf and Grendel's mother, and like this monstrous female character who was fiercely protective of her child, but also a grotesque looking being. I don't remember if it was, I know she was a monster, but I don't remember her actual physical form. I feel like throughout this collection, she sort of has made womanhood, especially from the perspective of this mental illness, as like anything but glamorous, because I feel like a lot of times women in media, in our stories, even when they're going through hardships, even when they're being, put through the ringer for the sake of a different character, for the sake of a male character, for the sake of the plot, for the sake of even her own strength, to say that she made it through, or she survived, or she's strong, or whatever the case may be, I feel like she's still portrayed in this way that is glamorous and desirable. And I think Elizabeth is turning that on its head and saying, no, this is not a glamorous situation. This is ugly, and it is grotesque and real, and this is an aspect of womanhood that is not talked about, because it makes everyone uncomfortable to see a woman in the throes of despair. There's one poem called Basement Mother, in which she really does allude to a physical, like, monstrous woman who hisses and is seething in darkness and like retreats into the basement because the world is like this cruel place to her, and it in turn feeds her own cruelty, and like the children are scared of her and the husband is scared of her as she hisses her way back down to the basement. And I think that poem really provides the distinction between sometimes what it feels like to go through a mental illness and what is portrayed in popular culture as what it's supposed to look like. We romanticize it in popular culture, which is destructive. We brush over it. We try to make it look desirable, or at the very least, we try to make it as like a trophy of strength. And it's none of those things. It's just life. I think that's the beauty of what Elizabeth has done, is that she's not sugarcoated anything out of a love for her readers. And I truly appreciate the insight that she's given, for being brave enough to share her story, for all of the research that she's done. This is definitely a labor of love, and I would highly recommend you read this if that is something that you're interested in. She states her work unapologetically, and I think we need more of that in the world and in poetry. So that is my take on Just to the Right of the Stove. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've read this, then definitely tell me about it in the comments. I always look forward to hearing you guys' thoughts and suggestions. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you are interested in following me on Instagram, you can find me at the Pose Quarter 46. Yes, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, week, and month, and I will see you in my next video, whenever that is. Bye.